Hello, this video presentation will outline some of the findings regarding shape processing in the ventral and dorsal pathways. Shape processing is an important aspect of visual perception. Erez Freud and colleagues used functional magnetic resonance imaging to study brain pathways involved and had some interesting findings about how shape is processed in the brain. The target of this study was the dorsal and ventral visual pathway systems. Previous studies in this discipline concluded that these pathways controlled two different processes. This was known as two pathways hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, it was believed that the ventral pathway was in charge of vision for perception, which would take in features and allow us to recognize objects. Freud and colleagues illustrated this concept as looking into a toolbox, full of tools and recognizing a hammer within it. On the other hand, the dorsal pathway was considered to be responsible for enacting vision for action, which processes the features of an object and aids in our interaction with it. Extending the hammer analogy, you can imagine this function in terms of recognizing a hammer as its functional components, which help in hammering in a nail. Freud and his colleagues felt, however, that this hypothesis was not entirely accurate nor complete. They felt that these models of sensory processing were outdated and that these two pathways may not be so independent after all. Freud and his colleagues had essentially set out to challenge the two pathways hypothesis. Studies had shown both pathways may be active when an individual views an intact object, and other research had unveiled the fact that the dorsal pathway may be responsible for mediating certain object representations. These findings constitute a gap in the literature, as there was not quite enough evidence to summate that both pathways become activated to perceive objects. But it was also increasingly becoming clear that both pathways become activated in similar ways. Moreover, it became important to highlight the activations and operations of the dorsal stream. Thus, the unknowns in this field now concerned the topographical organization of dorsal object representations, as well as the nature of visual properties encoded in these representations and how they contribute to our understanding of perceptual behavior. Freud sought to tackle this unknown as a research question and formulated two research studies using fMRI and psychophysical measures in order to gain an understanding of the roles of the dorsal and ventral pathways. Armed with the powers of previous research, these psychophysical measures and an fMRI scanner, Freud and his colleagues put forward their hypothesis as follows. The large-scale topographical organization of dorsal object representations obeys a spatial gradient in which posterior regions in the pathway derive shape representations and contribute to visual perception, whereas anterior regions are better and more effectively tuned to performing visual motor behaviors. This hypothesis was motivated and kick-started by two key issues regarding dorsal pathway function and needed to be cleared up. One, there is a need to reconcile recent findings of dorsal pathway activation with object-directed actions. And second, concerns the connectivity that anchors the parietal representation continuum, also known as the dorsal pathway, at one end with the caudal regions connected to the visual cortex, and at the other end with the more rostral regions anatomically and functionally connected to motor cortex.
The procedure of this experiment was quite run-of-the-mill. 22 healthy and willing subjects who passed through previous training on the stimuli and operations of the study were equipped with head coils and loaded into fMRI scanners that had LCD screens placed near the subject's head. The subjects were then presented with stimuli on screen, with functional images being based on the bold response. Freud and his colleagues decided to use two different experimental object scrambling methods that measure object perception in order to account for error. Both experimental objects involve the scrambling of intact objects and the measuring of brain activity. The first experiment only involved box scrambling. Here, subjects were presented with 160 grayscale images, 80 of everyday objects, and 80 of tools, with each image then being divided into 4, 16, 64, and 256 squares that were then randomly rearranged. This led to there being 5 conditions ranging from most scrambled to intact, those being S4, S3, S2, and S1, and full. The other involved what is called diffeomorphic object scrambling, which precludes identification of objects but keeps some of the fundamental object shape properties. With this method, subjects were presented with 320 grayscale images, 160 images of everyday objects, and 160 images of tools, but this time only one version of each picture was presented to prevent priming and adaptation. The decision to include these two separate methods stemmed from a couple limitations linked to the original box scrambling method. It increases the number of edges, which is something that the visual cortex is very sensitive to, and that it disrupts crucial shape properties, which eliminates the aspect of shape perception. The manipulation of having the diffeomorphic scrambling method along with normal box scrambling method allows for the re-examination of the large-scale organization of the two pathways, which is one of the central aims of this entire operation, and also allows for the disentangling and smoothing out sensitivity to shape versus identity information. This task is also completely non-invasive and can be outlined and learned with ease by numerous subjects, leading to efficient and straightforward runs. 3 analytical approaches were instilled to understand the findings of this research. Those approaches being a voxel-wise approach, an ROI analysis method, and a multivariate representational similarity analysis, or RCA. The voxel-wise approach was quite vanilla and straightforward. For this study, Freud and his colleagues generated a voxel-wise map of shape sensitivity for every visually selective voxel in order to efficiently map topographical organization of shape processing within the two pathways. A general linear model was constructed for each participant with a calculated beta value for each of the 5 conditions. In order to assess shape sensitivity, slopes of activation were calculated. The voxel location on the post-anterior axis was the independent variable, while the shape sensitivity was the dependent. This analytical approach acted to describe the spatial organization of shape processing in each visual pathway. For the ROI approach, Freud's group defined regions of interest based on a probabilistic atlas, like the ones shown here. For each ROI, they reproduced calculated beta weights for each condition with the linear slope between them used as a measure for shape sensitivity of that specific region, like they did for the voxel-wise approach as well. An RSA approach was then used to allow for a more fine-grained analysis of the pattern of activation per ROI. A multivariate investigation was also conducted to further understandings of representational space. Beta weights were extracted from each ROI separately for each run and condition, with the runs then being separated into 2 sets with similar visual info contained in each set. The correlations between all odd and even runs were then extracted in an asymmetric correlation matrix. The Spearman correlation was then correlated between the correlation matrix of each ROI and a shape model correlation matrix in order to examine whether shape information was similarly encoded in different regions of interest.
Freud listed 3 key findings that made his study successful, with those being the fact that the dorsal and ventral pathways followed a similar topographical organization with similar patterns relating to shape sensitivity. There was a high correlation between the representational structures of both pathways, and finally, the posterior dorsal pathway activation were correlated with recognition performance, which suggests that these regions might contribute to perceptual behaviors. The overarching and conclusive key finding was that there is novel evidence for shape representation existing along the dorsal pathway, which were quite similar to those along the ventral pathway. Freud and his colleagues succeeded in their objective. They disproved the major aspects of the binary and outdated principles of the two pathways hypothesis. The study methods were successful in illustrating the fact that dorsal object representations obey a spatial gradient, and that anterior regions of the pathway are better suited to visual motor behaviors.
The first major area of importance of these findings is in the diagnosis and treatment of individuals with perceptual disorders like agnosia, wherein subjects are unable to interpret sensation. The findings fit in the larger literature by disproving aspects of the two pathways hypothesis. Freud and his colleagues have expanded the literature on sensory processing and have opened the door for further testing into the conclusions they have drawn and the questions they have spawned as a result. Some limitations and cautions related to the conclusions of this study include the fact that the dorsal pathway is known to be highly responsive and sensitive to images of tools, conveying visuomotor info. So it could be argued that shape sensitivity along the dorsal pathway may in fact be a product of visual motor associations related to tools and not just everyday general shape processing. Freud and his colleagues also offered caution earlier in the study when they made sure to state that since participants in the box scrambling experiment were exposed to each object in all levels of scrambling, whereas in the diffeomorphic method, participants were exposed to objects with only one level of distortion. Thus, the comparison between behavioral performances in each of the experiments should be interpreted and compared with caution, with the above concepts in mind. Further research could possibly touch on the limitation involving the dorsal pathway and the idea that images of tools convey merely visuomotor activity. Studies could look to separate activity based on the observing of tools versus everyday objects more in depth to discover if there was some sort of confound within this material.